evacuation of Dunkirk, or what's been referred to as the Miracle of Dunkirk, was a pivotal moment of World War II that took place in its early stages from the 26th of May to the 4th of June 1940. In truth, Dunkirk was the culmination of one of the greatest military disasters in history. In response to Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 and the redeployment of its forces along its western borders with France, Luxembourg, Belgium and the Netherlands, France deployed its forces along its border with Germany, manning its heavily fortified Maginot Line. Whilst in the north, much of the 10-division-strong British Expeditionary Force, which represented the bulk of Britain's ground-based force capacity at the time, with the rest of the French army, positioned themselves along the border with Luxembourg and Belgium. After months of relative inactivity since Germany's initial invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, the pieces were now in place for the start of the real war, the Battle of France. The Allies assumed that the most likely attack would come via the Germans invading Belgium, a repeat of what they had done in World War I. And this was pretty much what happened when on the 10th of May 1940, Germany invaded Belgium along with Luxembourg and the Netherlands. Believing it to be the main German thrust, the cream of the Franco-British armies committed themselves north, pushing up into Belgium in order to halt the German attack. Once committed, however, the Germans enacted the second phase of their operation, with the cream of its army, the Panzer Corps, launching a surprise attack further south towards the centre of France through the Ardennes forest, a region that bypassed the French Maginot Line and was left poorly defended because it was considered impenetrable by motorised units. Utilizing the tactic of blitzkrieg, German tank columns cut through defensive lines, driving northwest to the English Channel, quickly flanking the best of the Allied forces in Belgium and cutting them off from the rest of their forces in the south. With communications between the British Expeditionary Force and French High Command in the south quickly breaking down, British General Viscount Gore began eyeing an exit strategy. With evacuation across the Channel deemed the best course of action, Gort ordered a withdrawal to Dunkirk, the closest location with good port facilities. In the matter of just a few days, Allied forces in continental Europe had been hopelessly outmaneuvered and exposed. In so doing, the Germans had dramatically achieved what they had failed to do in 4 years of fighting during World War I, from 1914 to 1918. A dejected French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, telephoned the newly appointed Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, with the bad news. "We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle. The road to Paris is open." It is hard to fully appreciate just how much of a devastating psychological blow such a swift and decisive tactical defeat had on Allied forces, particularly coming so early on in the war against a foe that was fast developing an air of invincibility. Just as important was the effect it had on civilian and public morale at home, particularly across the Channel in England, where the appetite for war with Germany was waning and Winston Churchill's position as leader was tenuous at best. The German approach to modern warfare as a science had exposed the flaws in an Allied command steeped in the habits of imperial rule, unaware of how much military tactics and technology had advanced since World War I. And so, with German forces encircling the Allied armies within a shrinking enclave around Dunkirk, defeat seemed imminent, with surrender at best and a massacre at worst. Pamphlets rained down on weary Allied troops in a propaganda campaign designed to break what remained of their spirits. Whilst from the air, the dreaded sound of the German Stuka dive bombers struck fear into the hearts of troops standing exposed on the beaches. Then, on the 24th of May, just as German armoured divisions were expecting to drive into Dunkirk, Hitler gave a surprise order to halt the attack. This decision has since gone down as one of the most monumental blunders in history, But it is a decision that has been judged with the benefits of hindsight, and even to this day, there is still debate as to the true nature of why it was made, and in fact, whether at the time it was the right call to make. Contrary to popular myth, what became known as the Halt Order did not originate with Adolf Hitler. Field Marshals Gerd von Rundstedt and Gunther von Kluge issued the order, and Hitler only sanctioned it the same day. Both generals had fought in World War I and realized that, like at the Marne in 1914, a sudden Allied counterattack could change the course of the whole war. In their eyes, this risk still existed because the British and French still offered resistance in neighboring areas. At the same time, German command wanted to give their armies time to rest, repair, and replenish after a thrust whose speed and distance had taken everyone by surprise, even themselves. So fast was this attack that the German forces had simply outpaced their supply lines, so slowing down may have at the time actually been the right call. Particularly as the tanks were about to enter a built-up urban environment, necessitating the need for solid infantry support on the ground. Besides, the Germans assumed the British had no way of getting all their troops off the continent, so speed wasn't the highest priority. The shallow waters around Dunkirk meant that the large naval ships capable of carrying lots of troops couldn't get close enough for a rescue, and any ships that attempted dock at the wharf would be sitting ducks for the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. So as far as the Germans and pretty much everyone was concerned at the time, Allied forces were trapped and not going anywhere. I mean, what were they going to do? Get hundreds of little boats and ships from somewhere and somehow ferry well over 250,000 men away from the beaches to safety? Not bloody likely. Well, as history records, that's exactly what happened. As part of Operation Dynamo, the plan to evacuate Allied forces from the beaches of Dunkirk, the British Navy requisitioned hundreds of small boats, ferries, fishing ships, merchant craft from across Britain. Some of these took troops back to the Navy waiting offshore, while others took them all the way back to England. Many of them made multiple trips, coming under constant attack from the Luftwaffe. 1/4 of the 665 small boats never got home, but despite this, the operation was a resounding success. The whole evacuation, which was initiated on the 26th of May, took about a week, and all in all more than 300,000 men were saved, including a fair amount of Canadian, Belgian, and French troops, as well as some Indian ones as well. It's important to note, however, that no one, and I mean absolutely no one, had any idea the operation would be as successful as it was. At best, even Winston Churchill hoped that maybe 30,000 men would be saved. The fact that the operation was such a success in the face of such overwhelming odds and circumstances is why it became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. But in calling it a miracle, we must not lose sight of the specific factors that came into play during those desperate few days that enabled it to be. The first and most obvious was the Halt Order itself. One key factor relating to the Halt Order that is rarely mentioned is the idea that there was a desire on the part of Hitler for a peace settlement with the British, and this was one reason for why he stopped his tanks. Hitler had always felt a certain kinship existed between the British and German people. And so the theory goes that there was therefore a desire on his part to avoid inflicting a devastating and humiliating defeat on them, so that they would be more open to the idea to negotiate. One often cited piece of evidence for this argument is that Hitler's order stopping his ground forces was sent unencrypted, making it possible for the British to hear and understand it immediately as a kind of peace offering. This is, of course, still hotly disputed amongst historians. But it's interesting that the ancient Chinese general, military strategist, and philosopher Sun Tzu, in his classic treatise on warfare, The Art of War, has the intriguing quote, "Build your opponent a golden bridge to retreat across." The idea behind this is that at all times you should make the option of avoiding conflict or surrendering during conflict appear more appealing to your enemy. Was this Hitler's intention? Certainly, Hitler's hopes for a peace settlement with the British were not unfounded, as even as the Dunkirk operation was underway, the British government was mulling whether to seek peace terms, with 5 members of the War Cabinet of Churchill's new government debating the wisdom of entering into peace negotiations. Churchill, of course, was having none of this, and made it clear that as long as he was in office, there would be no surrender. "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last," he vowed, "let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood on the ground." Interestingly, details of any peace offer to Churchill covering this time are still protected under the British Official Secrets Act, which was due to become public in 2017, but which has been extended for another unprecedented 20 years. So in the end, we can only speculate as to whether a peace offering was part of the reasoning for the Halt Order. Another argument put forward for the issuing of the Halt Order, which is far less favourable to Hitler than the idea of a peace offering, is the concept that it was issued in order to allow the Luftwaffe the honour of claiming the final victory at Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe were a far more politically allied branch of the armed forces to the Nazi Party, and its chief, Hermann Göring, was confidently promising that it could destroy the pocket without any need for the Wehrmacht to do much more than conduct mopping up operations afterwards. This, however, would prove not to be the case as a result of adverse weather conditions such as low-lying cloud, which hindered German bombing operations as well as the defensive efforts of the RAF. At the time, many of the troops on the ground at Dunkirk were not happy about the lack of presence by the RAF. However, the crews of the RAF were doing everything they could in the skies over northern France to prevent Luftwaffe planes getting through to the airspace over Dunkirk. Between the 27th of May and the 4th of June, the RAF lost 177 aircraft and the Luftwaffe 240. In that period, the RAF flew a total of 4,822 sorties over northern France. In the end, regardless of the debate and speculation that surrounds the reasons for the Halt Order, one thing that isn't debated is the fact that the crucial 48 hours it stood in place allowed the Allies precious time to establish a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk and fortify key parts of the city, opening up the narrow window of opportunity for the evacuation. It was this fact, along with the incredibly brave rearguard action mounted by French and what remained of the British expeditionary forces trapped on the wrong side of the defensive lines around Dunkirk, that enabled the miracle of Dunkirk to take place. These men had to resist the blitzkrieg at all costs and do everything they could to slow the German advance. The chilling reality was that for these men there was only 2 options: death or capture. It is a sad fact that in modern popular culture, through shows such as The Simpsons, the French have often been the butt of jokes with regards to their bravery during World War II. The fact of the matter is, however, that nothing could be farther from the truth. Yes, the French command had been found to be hopelessly lacking strategically, but that should not detract from the incredible bravery displayed by French troops, who not only established defensive lines, but heroically held those lines in the face of overwhelming opposition. This enabled vast numbers of their allied forces to not only retreat into the Dunkirk perimeter, but ultimately evacuate successfully from the beaches. Nowhere was this more evident than at the siege of Lille, when about 40,000 French troops outnumbered 3-1, delayed by 4 days 7 German divisions with 800 tanks, which were destined to destroy the Allies at Dunkirk. So brave were these soldiers that when the siege finally ended and the French were defeated on the 31st of May 1940, the German general Kurt Weger, in honor of the defenders of Lille and its suburbs, granted the honors of war to the remaining French troops, allowing them to march into captivity. In his celebrated book, The Second World War, Winston Churchill described the Allied defense of Lille as a splendid contribution which delayed the German advance for 4 days and allowed the escape of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. In the end, what became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk was far less a miracle than simply the result of the grit, determination, and above all else, bravery of men and women on both sides of the Channel in the face of overwhelming odds and no certainty as to the outcome. Make no mistake, Dunkirk was a defeat, pure and simple, and a resounding one at that. Whilst Britain was able to save most of its troops, it lost almost all of its tanks, artillery, and transports. In his big parliamentary speech on June the 4th, declaring the end of Operation Dynamo, Winston Churchill was adamant that wars are not won by evacuations, calling the events in France a colossal military disaster. But out of that disaster, a spirit was born which was to set the tone for British and Allied resistance to come. A spirit that Churchill was able to crystallise and rally when later in the same speech he spoke those famous words.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
It was a spirit that was able to unite and galvanise the British people behind the war effort and to fortify them for the next great battle to come, the Battle of Britain. When hunkered down in bunkers during the Blitz, the British people would face their darkest hour. Ultimately, it is for this reason that the miracle of Dunkirk was to prove such a pivotal moment in world history.